The radio message was less than a minute long, but it stopped one of the most dangerous military confrontations of the Cold War and may have prevented World War III because on the night of October 27, 1962, in the black waters of the Caribbean Sea, a Soviet submarine commander named Vasily Arkhipov refused to authorize a nuclear torpedo launch after a tense radio exchange revealed that the war everyone feared had not yet begun. And that single decision, transmitted and confirmed through crackling radio signals deep beneath the ocean, became one of the most important moments in human history. To understand how one message could halt the march toward nuclear catastrophe, it is necessary to return to the darkest days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the United States and the Soviet Union stood closer to all-out war than at any time before or since, and when misunderstandings, fear, and limited communication created a situation in which a single wrong move could have ended civilization. In October 1962, American reconnaissance aircraft discovered that the Soviet Union had secretly placed nuclear-armed ballistic missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, giving Moscow the ability to strike Washington, New York, and much of the eastern United States in minutes. And President John F. Kennedy responded by ordering a naval blockade, officially called a quarantine, around the island, warning that any Soviet ship carrying weapons would be stopped. And for 13 days, the world watched as American warships and Soviet vessels closed in on each other across the Caribbean. Both sides prepared their nuclear forces for possible launch. Bombers were placed on constant alert, missile crews were ordered to stand by, and even in secret underground bunkers, political leaders prepared for the possibility that the world was about to end. Amid this tension, 4 Soviet diesel-electric submarines were sent toward Cuba, each armed with a nuclear-tipped torpedo, and unlike most people on the surface, the American Navy did not know that these weapons existed, believing the submarines to be conventional threats only. One of those submarines, B-59, commanded by Valentin Savitsky, slipped beneath the American blockade and was soon hunted by U.S. destroyers dropping practice depth charges intended to force it to surface. But from inside the submarine, these explosions felt like a real attack, because B-59 had been submerged for days, running out of air and power, its crew exhausted, temperatures rising above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and communications with Moscow cut off, leaving the men inside to believe that war might already have begun. According to Soviet naval protocol, the launch of the nuclear torpedo required the consent of 3 officers on board: the captain, the political officer, and the flotilla commander. And aboard B-59, that flotilla commander was Vasily Arkhipov, a calm and experienced officer who had survived a nuclear accident aboard another submarine the previous year. As the American depth charges exploded around them, Savitsky became convinced that the United States had begun the war, and that his only option was to fire the nuclear torpedo, which would have destroyed an American warship and almost certainly triggered a full-scale nuclear exchange, and he ordered the weapon prepared for launch, but Arkhipov refused to give his authorization, insisting that they first establish whether war had actually begun. And when the submarine managed to receive a brief radio message from Moscow confirming that no hostilities had been declared, Arkhipov used that information to convince Savitsky to stand down, preventing the torpedo from being fired and halting what could have been the opening shot of World War III. The American Navy, unaware of how close it had come to annihilation, continued its blockade, while diplomats in Washington and Moscow worked frantically to negotiate a way out of the crisis. And within days, a secret agreement was reached, in which the Soviet Union agreed to remove its missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade the island, and the later removal of American nuclear missiles from Turkey. When the crisis ended, the world never knew how close it had come to destruction, because the incident aboard B-59 remained classified for decades, buried in Soviet military archives and forgotten by the public. And it was not until the end of the Cold War that historians learned how one radio message and one man's refusal to fire had stopped a nuclear battle before it could begin. Vasily Arkhipov never sought fame for his actions, But his decision is now recognized as one of the most important acts of restraint in modern history, because in a moment when fear and confusion could have ended, everything, a single transmission of truth, cut through the darkness and allowed humanity to step back from the brink, proving that sometimes the fate of the world can rest, not on armies or presidents, but on one voice carried through a radio signal in the depths of the sea.